All right, I will say good morning. What an incredible schus we have, Baruch Hashem, to begin. Maseches Gittin, what a journey, a very different Masechta than Maseches Sota in Eretz Hashem. First of all, much shorter pages, as you're about to see in Eretz Hashem. We actually have a chance of getting through an entire plot in a timely fashion. Let's begin by thanking our sponsors. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Iyar, Stephen Terry Zinn for dedicating all the Shumer and Drashos this month in honor of their newest grandson, Matan Shmuel Aaron. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, he will grow to become an incredible Ben Torah Ad Mea V'Esem Shanim Tovos. But with that, let us begin. So just by way of introduction, the Torah Kedosha tells us that as opposed to Bnei Noach, who affect marriage by simply living together, and who affect divorce by no longer living together, Torah tells us that if you have a situation where divorce is warranted, we'll discuss what warranted means, and in general, we're going to discuss the Torah's view, and Torah's hashkafa, on divorce itself. So the Torah says when that occurs, when that process is to be initiated, Torah says, V'kasav la'sefer krisos, v'nasan bi'ada, v'shilcha mi beso. Again, there's more to the pasuk, v'aisalish acher. Torah tells us that the husband has to write the wife a get. Many different details concerning that get. One of those details is going to be the subject of our Mishnah. So let's begin. Mishnah Beis Amud Aleph. Hamevi get Medinas Hayam. A person brings a get from Medinas Hayam, ultimately from overseas. Now I will say, this Mishnah is presupposing that it is not the husband who is bringing the get. Rather, the husband is sending a shaliach to go ahead and bring the get. We're going to discuss that in the world of Gittin. There's so much here that in the world of Gittin, ultimately, again, there's a concept of a shaliach laholacha and a shaliach lakabbalah. Shaliach laholacha means the husband is sending a shaliach, right? Literally laholacha to take the get. Shaliach lakabbalah, the wife ultimately has a shaliach ultimately to receive the get. So the way this Mishnah is set up is, Hamevi get Medinas Hayam means husband is overseas. Overseas as defined as outside of Eretz Yisrael. Husband is outside of Eretz Yisrael. The get was written outside of Eretz Yisrael. The shaliach is bringing the get from the husband outside of Eretz Yisrael to the wife who currently resides in Eretz Yisrael. Hamevi get mimedinas hayam, tzarich sheyomar befanei nechtav ubefanei nechtam. So the shaliach, when he delivers the get to the wife, has to make the following statement. This get was written in my presence, and this get was signed in my presence. Befanei nechtav, literally in front of me it was written. Befanei nechtam, in front of me it was signed. Take a look at Rashi. Going to do a lot of interesting Rashis today. Tzarich, Rashi says, Hashaliach hamavio. So the shliach who's bringing the get has to go ahead and recite. To both say, this is the line you have to say. This is it. He has to say the line. Here it is. So the Mishnah doesn't explain why he has to say this line, but this is the halacha. We'll say first halacha in Maseches Gittin, a shaliach brings a get from overseas, from a husband to a wife. When delivering the get to the wife, the shaliach has to say, this get was written in front of me, this get was signed in front of me. Here Rashi says, by the way, at the end of that Rashi tzarich, Rashi says over here, Ushliach zehabala so shliach la'olacha. Here it is. This shaliach that we are discussing, this is a shaliach appointed by the Baal, appointed by the husband, to deliver the get to the wife. Good. So we'll say, so that is our first halacha in Maseches Gittin. You bring a get from overseas to Eretz Yisrael, shliach has to say b'fanei nechtav or b'fanei nechtam. Why he has to say that, what the meaning of that statement is, we have no idea. Good, we'll get to it. Rabbi Gamliel says as follows. Next, Rabbi Gamliel says, Af hamevi min harekem u'min hacheger. Rabbi Gamliel comes along and says, even if you go ahead and you bring the get from Rekem to Chagar. Now I'll say, once again, we'll see in the Gemara what exactly is Rabbi Gamliel adding on over here. Rashi just says, Targum shal ben Kadash u ben Bar, Metargimina ben Rekem lechagar. So I'll say, we'll see exactly in the Gemara what, so Rabbi Gamliel is obviously coming to argue, further refine the Tanakama. We'll see in the Gemara. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Afilu mikfar ludim lulud. Even from Kfar Ludim to Lud. Now I will say, here's what's interesting. So Ludim and Lud, we know what he's referring to over here. Ludim, I will say, is a city outside of Eretz Yisrael. Lud is a city in Eretz Yisrael. Now, interestingly enough, Ludim and Lud were border cities. They were literally right next to each other. So Rabbi Eliezer is coming along and saying that even if you see, I will say, when you open the Mishnah, when you read the Mishnah, I will say, by the way, don't you feel like an excitement with the new Masechta, right? What's the excitement with the new Masechta? You feel also like, okay, this is going to be the one I'm not going to space out. Right, I'm not going to say sorry. I'm not going to lose it. I'm going to hold cup on this one, right? And also the beautiful part also is so as beautiful as much as we love Agarata, as much who doesn't love Agarata? Agarata is so vast, and the truth is, again, especially I was not doing it justice in terms of just the basic interpretation of the psukim. So it's hard to retain everything. When you get back to Gemara, right? We'll call it regular Gemara with sequential steps. It's exciting also because a person feels, you know what? Okay, I'm going to remember this. Like this, I could hold on to these various pieces. So Rabbi says, listen to this. Rabbi Eliezer says, even if you're bringing a get from Kfar Ludim to Lud. So look at Rashi for just a moment. Rashi says, Kfar Ludim, Shumi Chutz La'aretz. So Kfar Ludim is a city or a village outside of Eretz Yisrael. Lelud, Rashi says, Shi Smuchala Vihime Eretz Yisrael. So Rabbi says, so here's what's interesting. Rabbi Eliezer is coming along and saying, right, Mishnah gives us a halacha. What's the halacha of the Mishnah? If you bring a get from Chutz La'aretz to Eretz Yisrael, you have to say B'fanei Nechtav or B'fanei Nechtam. So obviously Rabbi Gamliel says even from Rekem to Chager, even from Rekem or from Chager. Okay, we'll have to see what that means. Rabbi Eliezer says even from Kfar Ludim to Lud. Now, what Rabbi Eliezer seems to be saying is, even if you're only bringing it from two cities which are literally right next to each other, but one is in Eretz Yisrael, one is in Chutz La'aretz, one is in Eretz Yisrael, you still have to say B'fanei Nechtav, B'fanei Nechtam. They both say it's not clear what Rabbi Eliezer is arguing. In other words, is he arguing on the Tanna Kama? Is he defining the Tanna Kama? So we'll have to see that in the Gemara. But clearly what he is doing is, when we have this vision of the opening line of the Mishnah, that if you bring a get from Medinas Hayam to Eretz Yisrael, what's the image you have in your mind? Right? Distance. So what Rabbi Eliezer is clearly coming to say is, even if mamish, there's no distance. Like they're border cities. You could hop in between the two. Still, if you're bringing a get from Medinas Hayam to Eretz Yisrael, you must say B'fanei Nechtav or B'fanei Nechtam. Good. The Chachamim say, Eino tzarech shomar B'fanei Nechtav or B'fanei Nechtav, Ela hamebi mimedinas Hayam v'hamolich. So I'll say the Chachamim come along and say, again I will say, it's not clear in the Mishnah what's going on. In other words, it seems to be that there's an argument, obviously, because the Mishnah is quoting all these different opinions, but it's not immediately clear what the argument is about. So the Chachamim say, you only have to say B'fanei Nechtav, B'fanei Nechtam if you bring a get from Medinas Hayam to Eretz Yisrael or Hamolich. And I will say, here the Chacham just added on something very interesting, which is the Molich part. What is Molich? So Rashi says over here, Eretz Yisrael leMedinas Hayam. So this is very interesting. The Chacham say, you also have to say, B'fanei Nechtav, B'fanei Nechtam, if you bring a get from Eretz Yisrael to Chutz La'aretz. So I will say, so here's what's interesting about this. The first statement of the Chachamim doesn't seem to be adding anything, right? Because, or I should say, they're adding to the chorus already. Everyone has said that if you bring a get from Medinas Hayam to Eretz Yisrael, you must say B'fanei Nechtav or B'fanei Nechtam. Okay, the Chachamim are saying that again, which seems to indicate they're arguing on something, but then they add on this additional piece of molich. They say even if you bring a get from Eretz Yisrael to Chutz La'aretz, you also have to say B'fanei Nechtav or B'fanei Nechtam. Good, we'll have to see what that means. But maybe Medinas Hayam, similarly, Chachamim say, what happens if you bring a get from one country or from one place to another place in Medinas Hayam? So we'll say this is now a third case, right? So the Chacham said is like this. Up until now, we've been focusing on the case of what? Maybe get from Medinas Hayam to Eretz Yisrael, right? And we established that in that case, you have to say B'fanei Nechtav or B'fanei Nechtam. It seems to me maybe there's some machlokes as to what exactly that means from Medinas Hayam to Eretz Yisrael. The Chacham then added on, also if you bring a get from Eretz Yisrael from Eretz Yisrael to Medinas Hayam, you also have to say B'fanei Nechtav, B'fanei Nechtam. And now Rabbi said there's a third thing that's being added. What's being added? Mimedina lemedina b'medinas hayam. What about bringing from one city or from one country to another city, to another country in Chutz La'aretz, in Medinas Hayam? So up until now, we've always been focusing on either Medinas Hayam to Eretz Yisrael, or Eretz Yisrael to Medinas Hayam. What about from one location to another location, but in Medinas Hayam? So now the Mishnah says, even if you bring a get from one location to another location in Medinas Hayam, right, in Chutz La'aretz, you also have to say B'fanei nechtav or B'fanei nechtam. Okay, Rabbi Shmuel says, Afilu mehegmonia lehegmonia. So what Rabbi Shmuel says, when it comes to B'fanei nechtam, even within one city which has two rulers. If you look at Rashi, mehegmonia lehegmonia, so Rashi says, Mefaresh, ir achas shahayu bashnei hegmonim. But let's say you have one city or one area, let's say even one state, one country that has two rulers. But the rulers are makpid about travel between the two sections. Even in that case, you have to say b'fanei nechtav or b'fanei nechtam. So what's interesting about this statement is the Mishnah seems to be indicating that there's something about b'fanei nechtav and b'fanei nechtam that is rooted in the concept of restricted travel. So we'll see in the Gemara what all of this is about. So what we're doing is, once again, just follow the progression. So we've started with the din of b'fanei nechtav or b'fanei nechtam, when you're bringing a get from Medinas Hayam to Eretz Yisrael, right? Then we further expanded it from Eretz Yisrael to Medinas Hayam. Now we further expanded it that even in Medinas Hayam itself, from one area to another area, there will also be a din of b'fanei nechtav or b'fanei nechtam. Good. Next, so let's go back to Rabbi Yehuda says, so now, of course, the interesting question that's going to come up is, so borders. So what are the borders of Eretz Yisrael, ultimately, again, for these halachos of Gittin? Because obviously it's going to be very important. Again, so I'll say the one thing that has not come up over here, in other words, the one area where everyone seems to agree, is what happens if you bring a get within Eretz Yisrael itself. What's going to be the halacha? It does not appear that you need any b'fanei nechtam. Right? We'll say that everyone seems to agree is in fact the case, right? Because again, that case is not brought up at all. So therefore, I have to know what are the borders of Eretz Yisrael for Hilchos Gittin purposes. Now, you'll say to yourself, Hilchos Gittin purposes, the borders of Eretz Yisrael, the borders of Eretz Yisrael. Not necessarily. Remember again, Eretz Yisrael has different borders for different things. There's the territorial area of Eretz Yisrael, which includes even areas that David HaMelech conquered, right? As a Milchemes Rishus, as we just saw in Masechus Gittin, right? So, for example, and then there's biblical borders of Eretz Yisrael, and now we're going to see there's Gittin borders of Eretz Yisrael. So, what are the Gittin borders of Eretz Yisrael? So, take a look at the Mishnah. So, Mishnah says, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Me'rekem le'mizrach ve'rekem kimizrach. Rabbi Yehuda says, ultimately, again, from Rekem to the east, and Rekem itself is considered like Chutz La'aretz, right? So there was a city, Rekem, in the east of Eretz Yisrael. Rekem itself is the eastern border of Eretz Yisrael for Gittin purposes, but the city of Rekem itself is considered to be Medinas Hayam. Take a look at Rashi. Rekem, v'Rekem atzma nidonos k'mizrach ha'olam, v'lo k'Eretz Yisrael. So we'll say, so the city of Rekem itself, just to be clear, essentially we'll say it's what we call in halacha, ad v'lo ad bichlal, up until but not including. So the eastern border of Eretz Yisrael is up until the city of Rekem, not including Rekem. Not including Rekem. Now this is actually an important Rashi. Rashi says over here, Rashi says, "V'rekem atzmei nidonos k'mizrach ha'olam v'lo k'Eretz Yisrael v'amevi me'rekem tzarich lomar b'fanei nechtav b'fanei nechtam." So we'll say, "Halacha l'maaseh, if you were to bring a get from Rekem, you would have to say b'fanei nechtav u'b'fanei nechtam. V'chein kulam Rekem le'mizracho shel Eretz Yisrael v'chutz la v'Ashkelon." So we'll say, actually, let's finish up the rest of the Mishnah. Ashkelon is the southern border of Eretz Yisrael, and Ashkelon itself is considered like Chutz La'aretz. So I would say, so I just want to point out something very interesting. This is why I was saying to you before, Eretz Yisrael has different borders for different things. Ashkelon is Eretz Yisrael. Ashkelon is Eretz Yisrael. For Gittin, we're going to see that Ashkelon was considered to be the border, and Ashkelon itself was considered to be like Chutz La'aretz. Like Chutz La'aretz, okay? Akko Litzafon, va'akko Kitzafon. Akko is considered to be the northern border of Eretz Yisrael, and what ultimately, again, Akko itself was considered to be like Chutz La'aretz. So we'll say, Meir says, no, Akko Eretz Yisrael again. Akko is the northern border, but again, Akko itself is considered to be part of Eretz Yisrael. Incredible. So Gemara says, Hamevi get Eretz Yisrael, and here it is. If a person goes ahead, I'll say, by the way, I'll just point out to you over here something interesting. Rashi points out, why is there no western border of Eretz Yisrael, right? We mention north, south, and east. Why no western border? So Rashi says, Aval Ma'ariv Shel Eretz Yisrael in Tzarech Gvul Shahayam Hagadol Gvula, because you have the Mediterranean. I'll say, so there again, it's pretty clear where the land ends. It ends at the sea. It ends at the sea. Okay, weiter, says the Mishnah. I maybe get Eretz Yisrael. But here it is. Now it's explicit. Person brings a get in Eretz Yisrael. There is no need for the shaliach to say befanei nechtav ubefanei nechtam, that it was written in my presence, signed in my presence. What happens if someone objects to the authenticity of the get? And I will say, who is going to be objecting to the authenticity of the get? The husband. So I say, remember again, that's what I want to point out. This whole Mishnah is set up that it's not the husband itself who is giving the get. The husband is sending the get with an agent. The Torah says that a husband has to give the get. So we know, I will say, so agency 101, Hilchos Shlichus 101 is that halacha l'maisa, so this whole Mishnah is set up with the idea that halacha l'maisa, a husband is delivering a get through his proxy, through his agent. So I will say, so what happens? So in Eretz Yisrael, you don't have to say fa'nechtam. So what happens if the husband goes ahead and shows up and says, the get is forged. I never went ahead and authorized the delivery of this get. So the Mishnah says, Yiskayim b'chos samav. Not a problem. The get will be solidified or validated through its signatures. In other words, what you'll have to do is, you'll have to find the witnesses who went ahead and signed on the get, have them attest to the validity of their signature, kiyam shtaras, and we're good. Then the get is valid. Look at Rashi. Yiskayim b'chos samav. Im ya'idu ha'edim al chasimas yidehem. Sorry. O ya'idu ha'edim al chasimas yidehem. O edim achirim yakiru chasimasan kasher. So I will say, in a situation in Eretz Yisrael, so I will say, what you begin to see from this is that when a shaliach says befanei nechtam, essentially what that is that is a validation of the get. Again, we'll see the mechanics of it. So now the Mishnah says, in Eretz Yisrael, you don't have to say befanei nechtam, which is great, except what do you do in a case then where the husband comes along and argues on the authenticity of the get? To which the Mishnah says, not a problem. You're going to have to go ahead and validate the get through its signatures. How do you validate a get through its signatures? So Rashi HaKadosh says two possibilities. Either find the actual witnesses who signed on the get and get them to validate their own signatures, or I will say the other possibility is find other witnesses who recognize the signatures of these witnesses. They validate the signatures, and that validates the get. That's the concept called kiyum shtaras, validating documents. You validate documents by validating signatures. Good. So Rashi says, we're going to see that in general, if somebody presents a get and there's no one objecting to it, by definition, we assume that halacha l'maisa, the get is an authentic one. Again, we'll get into more of this in the Mishnah. I just point out there's something very interesting. If you take a look at the top tosas before we go on, take a look at the top tosas hamevi get. So we'll say, if you look, you see in the short lines of that tosas, if you go about 3 lines in, so tosas points out of it, so it's something interesting. It says, Mashanoag in lichtov yud beis shuros beget. We'll say, we're going to see some examples of Gittin. Eretz Hashem. Actually, I'm going to have a little show and tell. I have some copies I want to show you. It's interesting to see as we get into the halachos concerning how a get is written. It's fascinating to see. A get is written 12 lines. Get is always 12 lines. So the Gemara says, we'll say, and that's independent of how long, the wife's name is. And again, we're going to see Gittin are fascinating because in a get, like when a person gets married, so what name do you put in a ksuva? You put their Hebrew name. In a get, not only do you put Hebrew names, but you put any names that they are known by. So you have a person who's named Ruvain, right? But his friends call him Bob. So in the get, it's going to be, Ruvain, Demiskari Bob. Right? And we'll literally write Bob, not in English, but in Hebrew, right? Bob. In other words, so no matter how many names, the names of the places, ultimately, a get is always 12 lines. Why? Omer Rabbeinu Tam, Mishum de get gematria yud beis. So it's interesting because the numerical value of get ultimately again is 12. So therefore, Rabbi said because the numerical value of get is 12, therefore a makpid to always make a get 12 lines. V'ri shama b'shem Rav Haigon b'shem Rabbeinu Saja mishum d'chsiv sefer krisus kashir yud beis shitin hamafsikin ben arba chumshei Torah. So we'll say others say Rabbeinu Saja has a different idea. He says the Torah calls a get a sefer krisus. Literally, again, a book of division. And we're going to say it's actually a halachically significant term as well. So I'll say, here's what's interesting. If you look throughout the entire Torah, remember again, between each Chumash, we actually just had this, between Bahar and Michul Kosai, end of Chumash Vayikra, and beginning of Chumash Bamidbar. So I'll say the way it works in Torah Kedosha is, there is a minimum, ultimately, again, of at least 3 lines, dividing between each chumash in the Torah, between each book of the Torah. There are 4 divisions, 12 lines. So the Torah calls a get a sefer krisus, corresponding to the 12 lines which separate, again, the multiple books of the Torah in the multiple books of the Torah as written in the Torah scroll. Okay, just an interesting. I will say one more piece. I just Hadrush. I saw this last night and I was just absolutely blown away by it. In the quoted from the Sefer Ateres, Yeshua, which was the Rabbi Yeshua of Dzhikov. So it is said that before Tfilas Geshem, remember again on Shmini Ateres, we go ahead and we recite Tfilas Geshem. So I will say, so Tfilas Geshem, remember, Shmini Ateres is the end of Din. Din begins on Chodesh Elul or Rosh Hashanah, and ultimately again concludes on Shmini Ateres. So before Tfilas Geshem, the story is told that the Ateres Yeshua got up, and the drasha that he gave was the opening Mishnah in Maseches Gittin. What was the drasha before Tfilas Geshem on Shmini Ateres? Hamevi get mimedinas hayam tzarech sheyomar befanei nechtav ubefanei nechtam. That was the drasha. Now the Balabatim loved the drasha. Why? Because it was short, right? That was it, right? That was the whole thing. But no one understood what the Rebbe was saying. So the Rebbe went on to explain something incredibly amazing. Hamevi get. He says, what's get? Get is Geshem and Tal. Geshem and Tal. So the Ribono Shel Olam is Hamevi get mi Medinas Hayam. Right? The Ribono Shel Olam. Remember, the Gemara Maseches Tainis says that there are 3 keys that HaKadosh Baruch Hu holds on to that he never gives out to a shaliach. And one of them is the mafteach of gishamim, of rain. So he's saying, Ribono Shel Olam, Hamevi get, you are the one who brings rain and dew, gishamim and tal, Mimedinas Hayam, from all over the world, right? And you know exactly what every land and what every country needs in order to be able to sustain. So Ribono Shel Olam, you control life. So Ribono Shel Olam, you who control life, Sarek Sheyomar, Befanai Nechtav, Kadosh Baruch Hu, you have to say that each of us has a ksiva tova, or befanai nechtam, and a chasima tova. I would say, so that was the drasha. That was the drasha of the Ateres Yeshua. You Ribono Shel Olam, who are maybe get Medinas Hayam. You who the one who ultimately ensures that everyone has the sustenance. You control everything. You control everything. Sarek Sheyomar, you have to say befanai nechtav or befanai nechtam, that every single yid will have a ksiva, a good inscription, and a chasima, a good sealing. I will say, is that not incredible? Is that not absolutely incredible? Anyway, I will say, it's a beautiful, beautiful idea to share. Let's go back there. Says the Gemara. I will say, so now let's get into it. My taima. So I will say, so now we've been introduced to this idea, ultimately again of befanei nechtav u befanei nechtam. Okay, so why? So I will say, so in other words, what is an interesting Mishnah, because the Mishnah takes it obviously again as a given that you have to recite this statement when bringing a get from Medinas Hayam. So okay, that's great. Why? Why does a shaliach who brings a get from a husband overseas to Eretz Yisrael, why does he have to say befanei nechtav, befanei nechtam? So we'll say our first major machlokes in the Masechta. Rabba and Rava says Amud Beis. Mechaya, right? What a mechaya, right? So Rabba says, why? Lefi she'in b'kiyim l'shma. So here we go. Let's take a step back before I get into this. We spoke about this before. Actually, I don't know if I alluded to this at the beginning of this year. A get has to be written l'shma. Rabba say, what does l'shma mean? L'shma means a get. The document itself has to be written for the sake of this man and the sake of this woman. Rabba say, what that means is, as opposed to a ksuva, For example, if you go to a ksuva, you go to a store, you want to buy a ksuva, and let's say again, you go to a store where they already have the chassan and kala's names filled in, right? And you say, listen, I'm a Ruvain marrying a Rachel. They say, right, no problem. They look it up. They've got a Ruvain and a Rachel. Perfect. You're good to go. You do not need your ksuva written for the sake of a husband and a wife. This stands in contradistinction to Gittin. A get must be explicitly written for this specific husband and wife. That's called lishma. Then I will say, what part of the get, how much of the get has to be in the short. So that's going to be a further discussion. Rabbi says, here's our problem. In Chutz La'aretz, outside of Eretz Yisrael, they were not always aware of this halacha that a get has to be written lishma. They weren't aware of it. So in order to attest to the fact that the get was written lishma, when the shaliach brings the get, what does he say? Befanei nechtav or befanei nechtam. So we'll say, what is it, when he makes that statement, this get was written in front of me, this get was signed in front of me, what is he saying? What is he saying? This get was written lishma. Look at Rashi, top Rashi, beis and beis. Lefi shem became lishma, ein b'nei medina sayam b'nei Torah. A strong statement, right? The Jews of the diaspora are not b'nei Torah. Ve'ein yodin shetzarich lichtov haget l'shem ha'isha. And they don't know that a get has to be written for this specific woman. Ukroksib, but there's a pasuk that says, v'kasav la sefer krisos. Law, so what's the pasuk says? You have to write for her a book of division, a sefer krisos. Law, lishma, hilchach, omer shaliach, befanei nechtav, ubefanei nechtam. So we'll say, now watch this. Rashi has a little bit of a different read on this. So Rashi says, here's the process, right? So Ruvain is divorcing Rachel. Ruvain lives, in Baltimore. Rachel lives in Eretz Yisrael. So what happens? The shaliach is bringing the get from Baltimore to Eretz Yisrael. So now what happens? The shaliach shows up and he says, "Befanei nechtav ubefanei nechtam." Okay. Now Rashi says, "Umamela shaimin alei." So Rashi, according to Rashi, "Befanei nechtav ubefanei nechtam" is the beginning of a conversation. Right? So shaliach says his speaking part. I saw this get written. I saw this get signed. And then what happens? We. Now both say, who's the we? Now, here's what's interesting. What you clearly see from this, is when Reuven delivers a get from Chutz La'aretz Eretz Yisrael, he's not just dropping it off at Rachel. Clearly, he's giving it in front of someone, right? Is it based in? Is it witnesses? That we're going to have to see. But look at the wording of Rashi. So right, Shliach shows up. He says, "B'fanei nechtav u'b'fanei nechtam." Okay. And then what happens? U'amela shaimin alei im nechtav lishma. Right? We ask him, by the way, Shaliach, was the get written lishma? V'hu omer in. And he says, yes. So we'll say, so again, let's kind of bring this together. So according to Rabba, why does a shaliach have to say b'fanei nechtav u'b'fanei nechtam? Why? Because we have a problem with Chutz La'aretz Gittin, Medina Sayam Gittin. What's the problem? There were Amei Aretz, people were ignorant. They did not know the get had to be written lishma for the sake of this man and this woman. So what happens? Chazal instituted, if you're a shaliach and you bring a get from Chutz La'aretz, you need to say b'fanei nechtav u'b'fanei nechtam. So here's the process. Shaliach shows up. Let's assume he's giving it in front of the Beis Din. Let's just assume that for just a moment. Right? So he says b'fanei nechtav u'b'fanei nechtam. We say, great. Tell us, did you see the get? Do you know? Was the get written lishma? So b'fanei nechtav u'b'fanei nechtam is the beginning of a dialogue. But the essence of the dialogue is the question, was the get written lishma? Now, say later on the Gemara is going to ask, so why don't you just, instead of saying fa'nechtam, what should the shaliach say? What should he see? Right? Get zu nichtav lishma. Why don't you just, so again, we'll discuss that. But according to Rabbah, we'll say, here's what it is. Fa'nechtam, because we're concerned the get wasn't written lishma, and this is how we ascertain the get was in fact written lishma. That's Rabbah. Rabbah says, this is incredible. So Rabbi said, this is fascinating. Rabbi says, no, we have a different issue, Rabbi. We have a different issue. You see, what happens when you go ahead and you bring a get, right? So when you bring it from overseas, so if the husband doesn't challenge it, no problem. The problem is, what happens if the husband does challenge it, or someone challenges it? The problem is, the witnesses who signed on it are overseas. If they're overseas, Rabbi say, what does that mean? They're not going to be easily accessible to validate the get, should it be subject to challenge. So Rava says, we make the shaliach say b'fanei nechtav u'b'fanei nechtam to validate the get, since witnesses to validate the get will not be readily available. Now look at Rashi. Let's put a little bit more meat on the bones. Rashi says, Rashi says, ein shayaros mitzuyos. Misham lekan. I will say, literally translated, there weren't always caravans going from Medinas Hayam to Eretz Yisrael. Right? There wasn't always transportation back and forth. If the husband comes along and says, I never wrote this get, so what's going to happen? Let's play this out. Right? So shaliach brings the get from Reuven to Rachel. Reuven's in Chutz La'aretz, Rachel's in Eretz Yisrael. Fine, shaliach brings the get. Now what happens? Reuven shows up and Reuven says, it's forged. I never wrote it. So just before we go on, what's the process and how do we work that out? We look on the document and we see, okay, Levi and Yehuda signed on the document. Okay, anyone know Levi and Yehuda? Right? How do anyone know? Right? Could we get them in here? Right? Or if we can't get them in here, ultimately, again, can someone else recognize your signature? So here's the problem. Because there wasn't regular, consistent, or reliable transportation between Medinas Hayam and Eretz Yisrael, if the get is contested, it's not going to be easy for us to find or track down the Eidim so that they can validate their signatures. Or for that matter, to find other Eidim who would recognize their signatures. Therefore, what happens? So according to Rava, listen to what happened. According to Rava, essentially, this is fascinating. We allow the shaliach to essentially be makayim the shtar. When the shaliach delivers the get, we have a two-step process happening over here. Number one is delivery of the get. Number two is proactive validation of the get. Proactive validation. So when the shaliach comes along and he says, "Befanei nechtav ubefanei nechtam," what he's doing right there is he's validating the get. And it seems to be, according to Rava, once he goes ahead and he validates the get, then what? There is no longer subject to dispute. We're done. Okay, so we'll say here it is. Machlokes Rabba and Rava, as to why you have to say b'far nechtam. Rabba, ultimately, again, because B'nai Medinas Hayam were not proficient in the dins, the halacha of lishma, and therefore, again, when the shaliach shows up and he says b'far nechtam, ultimately, again, he's ascertaining or he's validating the fact that the get was written lishma, right? According to Rava, no. What he's doing is he's validating the get itself, really the signatures. Since halacha l'maaseh, if the get is contested, it's not going to be easy to get the witnesses or to find someone who knows the witnesses from Medinas Hayam. Therefore, the shaliach comes, he proactively validates the get. Incredible. So we'll say, okay, it's interesting, machlokes, but where is the practical difference between these two opinions? Listen to this, da'asyu betrei. Very interesting. I will say, good enough kamina would be, what happens if instead of one witness bringing the get, two witnesses bring the get? If two witnesses, or two shluchim, right, two agents, right, two shluchim bring the get, do they have to go ahead and say befanei nechtav or befanei nechtam? So we'll say, so interestingly enough, according to Rabba, who says that befanei nechtav or befanei nechtam is necessary to go ahead and show that the get was written lishma, even if two witnesses bring it, they would still have to keep saying witnesses. Even if two agents bring it, they would still have to say it. But ultimately, again, according to Rava, where it's really a din in kiyum shtaras, it's really a din in validating the signatures on the get. If you have two agents bringing it, that's effectively two witnesses. They don't have to say anything. The mere presence of two people bringing the get is enough to go ahead and validate the get. Inami, we'll say another good nafkamina. Another good nafkamina would be Medina leMedina be'Eretz Yisrael. Very interesting. What about from one city to another city in Eretz Yisrael itself? So we'll say, so according to Rabba, do you have to say befanei nechtav or befanei nechtam from city to city in Eretz Yisrael? According to Rabba, no. Why not? In Eretz Yisrael, they know what to do with lishma. According to Rava, they will say, remember, if it's from one city to another city, or from one country to another, one province, maybe there's a transportation issue. If there is a transportation issue, then Einach Inami, you would have to say, befanei nechtav or befanei nechtam. Inami, other possible, another nafkamina would be, ba'osa Medina b'Medinas Hayam, within the same city, but in Medinas Hayam. So according to Rabba, who says it's a din of Lishma, you would still need befanei nechtav or befanei nechtam. Since halacha l'maaseh, again, it's in Chutz La'aretz, therefore there's a problem of befanei nechtam. According to Rava, there's no transportation issue, and therefore again you wouldn't need it. So we'll say, so therefore again, let's just solidify this for just a moment. So three different nafkaminas. Without going back to the nafkaminas, we'll say here's what we know. Mishnah tells me. Let's just go with what we know. Mishnah tells me. right? Reuven is divorcing Rachel, sends the get with a shaliach from Baltimore to Eretz Yisrael. What's the halacha? Shaliach shows up with the get. What does he need to do? He needs to say, b'fanei nechtav or b'fanei nechtav. That's what we know. Why does he have to say it? Machlokes Rabba and Rava. Rabba says, because whenever a get shows up from Chutz La'aretz, what are we concerned about? Lishma. Do they really know what they're doing in Chutz La'aretz? Right? Do they know what they're doing? Right? Was the get written for the sake of this man, for the sake of this woman? Therefore, when the shaliach shows up and he says, "B'fai nechtam," that's an entry point for a dialogue. We say, very interesting. Tell us, was the get written lishma or not? Right? He's going to say yes. We're good to go. According to Rava, what are we concerned about? Not lishma. According to Rava, what we're concerned about is that halacha l'maisa, husband's going to show up and husband's going to say this get was forged, or I was coerced, or whatever it is, whatever it might be. I will say, remember, if we're going to allow a woman to get married with a get, the one thing we have to ensure is that it's fireproof, it's bulletproof, right? In other words, that halacha l'maisa, no one could come and overturn it later on, because that would be a disaster. So what do we do according to Rava? According to Rava, what we want to do is we want to validate the get proactively. So what's the problem? If the get is coming from Chutz La'aretz, and then ultimately, again, it's challenged, it's going to be difficult to find the witnesses from overseas, or to find other people who recognize the signatures of the witnesses from overseas. So essentially, what do? We have the shaliach who brought it essentially validate the get. And he says, "B'fanei ultimately, I'm attesting to the validity of the signatures on this document." Beautiful. Beautiful. I'll say, now let's go. Ulu Rabba, l'damar l'fishay mikin l'shma li'bai trei. We'll say, so now the Gemara asks a good kasha. Listen to this. So Rabba, what you're saying is like this. I just want to point out, a fundamental halachic in Rabba and Rava is Rabba has a general concern about every single get that comes from Chutz La'aretz, right? So I will say, essentially, according to Rabba, when you have a get that shows up from Chutz La'aretz, right? What is Beis Din thinking? Get shows up from Chutz La'aretz. What is Beis Din thinking? Oh no, right? These guys in Chutz La'aretz, they don't know what they're doing, right? Oh no. So we'll say, essentially, every single get that shows up from Chutz La'aretz, we're really not sure about the validity of it, about validity. So when the shaliach says b'fanei nechtav u'b'fanei nechtam, what we're really doing is we need to create a stempel on the get, like the kashrus of the get. They both say this is different than Rava. According to Rava, what are we concerned about? We're concerned about something that may happen. All right, see, you hear this nuanced distinction? According to Rabba, when the get shows up from Chutz La'aretz, we are concerned, is this a kosher get right now? Was it written l'shma or not? According to Rava, what we're concerned about is what may happen later on. What are we concerned about? Right? According to Rava, what are we concerned about? According to Rava, what are we concerned about? Right? That the husband may show up later on and challenge the validity of the get. And if he does that, we may be stuck to produce the witnesses who signed on the get or who recognize the signatures of witnesses on the get. So according to Rava, when that get from Chutz La'aretz shows up, I believe that get is kosher. I'm just concerned about what could occur in the future. According to Rabba, when that get shows up, I'm literally not sure if it's kosher. I don't know if it's kosher because I don't know, was it really Rabba say it's such a fundamental difference. So based on the Gemara says, watch this. Rabba, according to Rabba, who literally is worried about the actual kashrus of the get. Like, is the get kosher or not? Is the get kosher or not? Was it written l'shma li'bai trei? The truth is, you really need two witnesses or two agents. I was supposed to say, if the shaliach is actually testifying about the halachic validity of the get, so that's not a din in one person. You should need two people. Because really what the shaliach is doing over here is he is actually testifying that the get is a kosher get. If you're testifying about halachic status, which impacts Isha Sisha, this is like pretty serious stuff, you should require two witnesses. We'll call it two agents, but it's two agents who are acting as two witnesses. Why is it any different than any other testimony? I will say, according to Rabba, when the shaliach says, I will say, what is he effectively saying? I hereby testify that what? That this get was written lishma. Whoa, that's big stuff. That's big stuff. That's testimony. If it's testimony, that requires two witnesses. To which the Gemara answers, no, it's okay. Why? Why Eid Echad Ne'eman B'Yisurin? So we'll say, here we go, fascinating. So halacha l'maisa, it's okay because Eid Echad is Ne'eman B'Yisurin, right? Eid Echad ultimately, again, is believed in matters of Yisur. Now, both say, where do we know this from? Take a look at Rashi. Rashi is in the wide lines, 5 lines in. Eid Echad Ne'eman B'Yisurin, Shari ha'emina Torah kol echad ve'echad miYisrael ala frashas truma va'ala shchita va'al mikra agid va'chelev. Now, this is actually fascinating. So we'll say, halacha l'maisa, and Eid Echad is believed. We know that we'll say you don't need eidos, that you separated out truma and meiser, that you took out the sciatic nerve from your meat. In other words, we'll say we're all believed on these things ourselves, right? Why? Because the Torah believed in Eid Echad when it comes to Isser. I just point out something interesting. If you see Tosas, Eid Echad Ne'eman B'Yisurin. It's like the 5th to last Tosas. The first Eid Echad. If you look at the last 2 lines of it, Tosas says, Ve'im Tomar, u'minalam de Eid Echad Ne'eman B'Yisurin. Tosas has a different approach. Tosas says, from where do we know that one witness is believed when it comes to Isser? Tosas is incredible. Yeshlomer de afinon minida, de darshina beparak hamadil, v'safra la li'atzma. We actually had this smichas chavar. Shabbos says, so again, the Torah says, when a woman has to count Shiva Nikiyim. I mean, Midaraisa, she doesn't have to count Shiva Nikiyim, but whatever, leave that on the side. Whatever amount a woman has to count before she goes to the mikvah, v'safra Allah. We'll say a woman doesn't need eidos, that she's no longer a nida, right? Halacha l'maisa, she keeps track of that count herself, and she is believed. So we'll say, so just an interesting, we're not going to get into why there is a machlokes Rashi Tosas, because obviously they're arguing on something. They're arguing on the makar, on the source, for the concept of Eid Echad Ne'eman B'Yisurin. According to Rashi, the concept of Eid Echad Ne'eman B'Yisurin is really just, it's clear. I'm believed to say that I separated out Trumas and Maestros on my produce. I will say, failure to separate out Trumas and Maestros on produce is a very serious transgression. It's an Isser. Yet I, as an Eid Echad, believed. Tosa says, the makar, the source ultimately, again, is Hilchos Nida. A woman is believed to say when she's a Nida, when she's not a Nida. Halacha l'maisa, again, Eid Echad Ne'eman B'Yisurin. But bottom line, whatever the source is, Eid Echad Ne'eman B'Yisurin. When it comes to matters of Isser, a single witness is believed. Say, for the Gemara wants to suggest over here, this is a situation of Isser, right? Why is this? Which Isser are we talking about over here? Which Isser? Ish is Ish, married woman. So therefore, again, when according to Rabba, when an Eid Echad, right, get comes from Medina Sayam, we're not sure ultimately, again, is the get valid or not. Eid Echad, right? The shaliach says befanei nechtav ubefanei nechtam. He is an Eid Echad who is saying the get was written lishma. Eid Echad Ne'eman B'Yisurin. Okay, beautiful. The Gemara says, one second. It's fascinating. When do we say Eid Echad? When do we say that Eid Echad is Ne'eman B'Yisurin? When do we say that? Kegon chaticha safek shal chelev safek shal shuman. So both say this is interesting, and this line in the Gemara seems to go both against Rashi and Tosas, which we'll discuss. Both say, when do we say Eid Echad Ne'eman B'Yisurin? Right? When do you say that Eid Echad is believed when it comes to a matter of Isser? Both say that's in a case of Delo Ischazik Isura. So both say this is incredible. That's in a situation where the Isser is not solidified, or the Isser is not concretized. It's a suffix. For example, you have a piece of meat. You're not sure. Is the piece of meat kosher? Is the piece of meat not kosher? An Eid Echad is believed to say kosher. Kosher. Why? Because the Isser identity is not solidified or concretized. That's where an Eid Echad is believed. I want to take a look at Rashi. Rashi says, so I'll say this is incredible. So, by the way, where the Gemara gets this, that Eid Echad is only Ne'eman Lo Chazik Isur, we're going to see it. So this Gemara is entertaining over here. Yeah, Eid Echad Ne'eman B'Yisurin when? Essentially, in a case of Safek. In a case of Safek, when there is the potential of Isser, but not solidified or concretized Isser, that's when an Eid Echad is believed to come along and say, it's not Isser, it's Mutter. However, Aval Hachad is Chazik Isura, the Eish Ish say, this is a case of Ischazik Isura. What does it mean Ischazik Isura? The Isser is solidified. I will say, what's the Isser? Right? Eish Ish. This is a married woman, right? Rachel is a married woman. I will say, remember again, everyone agrees her status is that she's married. The shaila is, could the get go ahead and change that status? Have davar sheba erva. Rabbi say, this is not a matter of Isser. This is what we call a davar sheba erva. Rabbi say, davar sheba erva means a matter of morality. And when it comes to a davar sheba erva, ve'in davar sheba erva, pachos mishnayim. And I will say, ultimately, again, when it comes to a davar sheba erva, that requires a minimum of two witnesses. In other words, Rabbi say, you may be right. Maybe it is true, Eid Echad Ne'eman Bisurin. Maybe that is true. When it comes to the matter of Isser prohibition, Eid Echad is believed. But first of all, the Gemara wants to suggest, when do we say in Eid Echad is Ne'eman Bisurin? Telo is Chazik Isura, where the Isser identity has not been solidified. But this over here is a situation where the Isser identity is solidified. This is a matter of Ishes Ish. This has to do with the status of a married woman. This is a davar sheba erva. I both say this is the halachos of arayis. When it comes to halachos of arayis, you need two witnesses. Take a look at Rashi. Ein dvar erva, roi latir b'pachos mishnaim diyalif davar mar. So we actually just had this in Sota as well, right? So I both say there's a gzera shava of davar. Kimatza ba ervas davar by erva. Davar by mamon, by monetary matters. Ksiv achli kimatza ba ervas davar, uksiv hasam apishnayim edim yakum davar b'mesech sota. Is this not the best part of Daf Yomi? What a feeling it is, even if I don't remember it, right? If I remember it, I know that I just learned this, right? I know that, right? This, well, not that just, this was Gimel Abay. This is like 5 years ago. Right? So it's the best feeling in the world. I did that. I did that Gemara. Shabbos, I said, remember again, we actually did this drush a couple of times. Halacha l'maisa, there's a gzera shav of davar, right? Ki matzah ba erbas davar, matter of morality, davar. Apishnayim edim yakum davar, through the testimony of two witnesses, davar. The monetary matter will be established. Just like monetary matters require two witnesses, so to what? So to halacha l'maisa, divar erva, arayas, immorality matters or morality matters also require two witnesses. Shabbos say, so what's going on over here? According to Rabba, let's take it full circle. Rabba, if you're saying that b'fan nechtam is because we are really concerned that Gittin written overseas are not written l'shma, that they're not valid, and so this witness is this shaliach, this agent / witness is essentially saying, I testify that the get was written l'shma. Whoa, you can't do that with one witness. That needs two witnesses. This is a davar sheba erva. This is a matter of morality, and therefore, if he's testifying about the l'shma identity of the get, that should require two witnesses. To which the Gemara will say, watch this. To which the Gemara says, you're right. Ruv b'kiyan hein. In reality, Rabba doesn't mean to say that they don't know what they're doing in Chutz La'aretz. That's not what he meant to say. In reality, the majority of Bnei Chutz La'aretz know what they're doing. The majority of Gittin that come from Chutz La'aretz ultimately, again, are written l'shma. They're written l'shma, so I will say, and therefore Rashi says, ve'in l'choshan, there's really nothing to worry about. But Rabbi Meir, but even according to Rabbi Meir, who says you have to normally be concerned for the miot, for the minority, stam sifri dedaini migmar gemiri. We'll say people who are sofrim, they know what they're doing. Person doesn't become a sofer if he doesn't know what he's doing. So we'll say, so now, watch, it's almost like a 180. So it turns out Rabbi says, you know what, the truth is, we're actually very confident that Gittin written in Chutz La'aretz are written in the right way, right? Because the majority of people know the halacha, and certainly sofrim, even Rabbi Meir is choshesh l'miuta, certainly sofrim know what they're doing. So why do you need b'fai nechtam? For Rabbanan hu da'atzrach. We'll say ultimately again, it was the rabbis who required it, right? It was rabbis who required it. They will say, why did the rabbis require b'fai nechtam? Take a look at Rashi. Rashi says, last Rashi on the daf, for Rabbanu hu datzvichu lemechash lemelsa mishum deika de'ashkach kasav va'omed kegon shenechtav l'shem echam ne'iro sheshmo kishmo u'shmo kishmo v'nimach milagaresh. So both say the Rabbanu were concerned just for a very unique case, which was Reuven's divorcing Rachel, right? And it happens to be he's in the market for a get. He sees that someone threw into the garbage a perfectly good get that was also between a Reuven and a Rachel. So he figures, chaparan, it's a simin min hashamayim. The devotion wants me to divorce my wife, right? If Hashem, I say it's always incredible to see how people intuit different divine signs, right? So the I found this get, it has my name, it has your name, it's Bashert, it was Bashert that we got married, it's Bashert that we're divorced, right? So that's what Chazal were concerned about. So both say, so now, by the way, I just want to point out, this is a total 180. Oh, well, not a 180, like a 170. Right? So we'll say, so now what's happening over here is essentially we started out with Rabba saying that halacha l'maisa in Chutz La'aretz, they don't know what they're doing with l'shma. They don't know what they're doing. And therefore I say, in order to ascertain that the get was written l'shma. Okay, but if that's the case, really you should need two witnesses. No, they know what they're doing in Chutz La'aretz. And even Rabbi Meir, who's normally choshesh for the miut, for the minority, will say, Sofrim certainly know what they're doing. So what's the Yeshua Rabbi say? Chazal, the rabbis, wanted you to say B'fanechta, B'fanechta. So we're going to stop over here for today. We're going to finish up Rabba Eretz Hashem tomorrow and see how the rest of this plays out by Rabba's Rava say. Shkoyach. What a first half of Maseches Gittin. Shkoyach, everyone. All right, Chavran Zoom, have a great day, everyone. Good to see everyone.